May this fair land we love so well in a dignity and freedom dwell. For worlds may change and go awry, while there is still one voice to cry.
At last, a unique legal victory for Anglo-German forensic history. This circle of British comrades with track record veteran integrity meet in August 2020 to celebrate a surprise birthday.
I give you a toast, ladies and gentlemen. I give you a toast, ladies and gentlemen.
All present expected that this birthday would not be possible to celebrate again with this person for more or less 7 years.
For worlds may change and go awry, while there is still one voice to cry.
Friends, tomorrow is Michèle's birthday, and on this happy day it has been felt that a few words are in order.
Good Lord.
And we are all very fortunate in having Michèle as a companion and a fellow campaigner for truth in history and for the honour and justice of our cause and our people and our civilization.
Lord.
Lord, you're right. Get on our knees and pray, good Lord. Hallelujah. So, it's been my belief for many, many years in this business that there are 3 virtues in this business, particularly. The first is courage, the second is energy, and the third is knowing the facts of what we're all about.
Yes.
Yeah. And the overall combination of those 3 really is a winning formula. And our friend Michèle has got courage galore, energy galore, and knowledge galore. I could go on and speak at great length here, but I think it's not suitable that we speak at great length here. We want to speak amongst ourselves. However, I will say that we're friends here, we all know each other, and I would just say 2 things here at this moment. Michèle has produced some historically very important DVD films with her camera team. And in addition, Michèle has given vital support, moral and practical support to the most worthy, the most deserving and the bravest people whom we know. I think we know who I'm talking about. That sounds like the champagne bottles are bursting already. The champers is bursting already.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, cheers to the rescue, cheers to the rescue.
Did someone shoot you then,
That's the procedure.
So, I would just add one rather serious note here. Later this year, Michèle has to appear in a court in Germany for a statement that Michèle made 2 years ago in Dresden at a meeting commemorating the victims of the bombing of that city in February 1945.
Und ich begrüße ganz herzlich Michèle Renouf.
Kameraden, ladies and gentlemen of Germany.
So, hallo liebe Damen und Herren aus Deutschland.
I did not expect to speak. I expected only to come to support you. So I am impromptu to speak.
Ich habe nicht damit gerechnet, vor euch zu sprechen. Ich hatte eigentlich nur vor, euch zu unterstützen, aber jetzt spreche ich zu euch.
I would like to say that when I arrived, a German woman came to me and said, as an English person, you have no right to be here.
Als ich eintraf, kam eine deutsche Frau zu mir und sagte, als eine englische Person haben sie kein Recht, hier zu sein.
Now I understand very much how she feels.
Ich verstehe sehr gut, wie sie sich fühlt.
And I would respectfully say the reason why English people should be here.
Und ich möchte jetzt mit dem allergrößten Respekt erklären, warum englische Menschen hier sein sollten.
Because we can tell you what the British policy makers said and planned against the German civilians.
Wir können euch erzählen, was die englischen Politikmacher geplant haben mit den Deutschen.
I can quote to you from my film. I make documentary films. This one is about the Dresden Holocaust, and an apology to Germany is due.
Ich kann zitieren aus den Filmen, die ich gemacht habe, und dieser Film handelt von dem Dresdner Holocaust. Okay.
Yes. There was one Holocaust in 1940s, and it deserves to be called a Holocaust, and none other do, except for the Japanese.
Es gab ein vollständiges Verbrennen 1940 und wie heißt das?
Except for the Japanese, the Japanese had a Holocaust.
Und es gab das komplette Verbrennen in Japan.
And the one in this country and in Europe was the one on the German civilians. They were burnt alive. That is what a Holocaust is, a burning alive. And only the German civilians were burnt alive. Only the Germans may call it a Holocaust.
Und das Wort Holocaust, komplettes Verbrennen, bedeutet bei lebendigem Leibe verbrannt zu werden. Und das ist das, was hier in Deutschland passiert ist.
Now in this film, I quote from the British policymakers and also from the evil of Winston Churchill, who said we intend to baste the German civilians. Baste is when you cook a chicken, a roast chicken, and you pour boiling oil on it to cook it.
Also, ich kann zitieren von dem, was englische Politiker gesagt haben, insbesondere der überaus freundliche Winston Churchill, der gesagt hat, wir werden die Deutschen frittieren wahrscheinlich, braten, wie man ein Hühnchen brät, indem wir Öl über sie gießen.
We are told in the records, in the historical records, that the war ministry intended to goad Adolf Hitler to bomb Germany because Adolf Hitler did not want to bomb Germany.
A clamour at the time in the spring and early summer of 1940 for the war to be ended. A leading conservative politician within the ranks of the British establishment, I'm referring here to Rab Butler. Rab Butler and others said this war is serving no purpose, it is damaging Britain, it is damaging the future of Britain and should be terminated with some sort of agreement, some mutual agreement. And the peace feelers being put out by the German government should be responded to.
If Churchill had accepted Hitler's peace offer in the summer of 1940, that would have been the end of Churchill's illustrious career. He would have been voted out of office, Lord Halifax or some other worthy would have taken his place, and Churchill would have been written off history the way that he wrote Chamberlain off history. If you remember, Churchill said about Chamberlain, when Chamberlain was near death, he said, poor old Chamberlain, there he goes. History will be very harsh on him because I know that I'm going to be writing the history. And I think Chamberlain, of course, has had a bum rap from history ever since. I think he's one of the men who tried most valiantly to preserve the peace and the British Empire.
So said voices in the British establishment, including Rab Butler. Unfortunately, the war party with the new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, intended that the war should commence. And their technique was to extend the war into so-called strategic bombing of cities hundreds of miles behind the front lines.
The primary purpose of these raids was to goad the Germans into undertaking reprisal raids of a similar character on Britain. Such raids would arouse intense indignation in Britain against Germany and so create a war psychosis without which it would be impossible to carry on a modern war.
Mr. Dennis Richards writes, If the Royal Air Force raided the Ruhr, destroying oil plants with its most accurately placed bombs, and urban property with those that went astray, the outcry for retaliation against Britain might prove too strong for the German generals to resist. The attack on the Ruhr, in other words, was an informal invitation to the Luftwaffe to bomb London.
And so it was that Churchill gave the order for the bombing of German cities hundreds of miles behind the front line. And inevitably, after a few months of having their cities bombed, the Germans retaliated. And they started bombing London, Coventry, Birmingham, Liverpool and other British cities.
Hitler only undertook the bombing of British civilian targets reluctantly, 3 months after the RAF had commenced bombing German civilian targets. Hitler would have been willing at any time to stop the slaughter. Hitler was genuinely anxious to reach with Britain an agreement confining the action of aircraft to battle zones.
The tragedy was, of course, that when the British cities were bombed, the British have never been told that this was in retaliation, in legitimate retaliation, that all the British public knew was that their cities were being bombed, and of course a clamour went up for retaliation in the opposite direction. And so the dreadful dynamics of the aerial bombardment of civilians took its dreadful course, and as a result of that, we have in Britain to mourn the death of 50,000 civilians and, of course, the 50,000 aircrew who were killed in that dreadful bombing campaign. And yes, and so the whole bombing war was totally unnecessary.
As observed by Philip Knightley, a war correspondent for The Times, in his book about Truth, the First Casualty of War, quote, "Churchill was obsessed with getting America into the war. He tried to frighten Roosevelt with the prospect of an early German victory. He searched for an outrage, such as the sinking of the Lusitania in the First World War, that would arouse American public opinion. German bombing of British citizens might well achieve this. But for weeks it looked as if the Germans had no intention of being so obliging." End quote. Because we were doubtful about the psychological effect of propaganda's distortion of the truth, that it was we who started the strategic civilian bombing offensive, we have shrunk from giving our great decision of May 11th, 1940, the publicity it deserves.
I see you have the book of David Irving here with you, Richard. I believe when he wrote that in 1963, before that the general public did not understand the issues that you are speaking about.
I think he had regrets about the bombing that he had done, because after the war he tried to make out that he hadn't known it was going on. Victor Gollancz, who was a famous publisher, who was going to publish my Dresden book originally, Victor Gollancz went to see him, and Churchill said to him, the one thing I thought was very, very wrong was the bombing of Dresden and these cities. And Victor Gollancz said, "Winston, how can you say that when, of course, as you know, you were the one who gave the orders?" And this was Churchill already window dressing and trying to change the course of written history. But thanks to people like me, you can't change the course of written history. I made plain very early on that when you're a historian, if you're not a conformist historian, very early on you find out you've got a choice in life as a historian, and you've got the choice of either being rich or writing the truth.
I wonder, can you explain the issue that they now try to use to say it wasn't about the idea of bombing Dresden was for some strategic reason? We spoke about it earlier. Can you recall
Yes.
what is that argument and why it's fallacious?
David Irving served truth and the honour of Britain, it can be said, wonderfully with this book. Prior to the publication of this book in 1963, some 20 years, 18 years after the dreadful events, David Irving exposed the full horror of Dresden, which until that time had been kept from the British people. They had not understood quite what had happened in Dresden. The death toll may be as much as 100,000.
I spent months reading something like 2 million of these telegrams sent by the SS and the police commanders all over Europe, And that's where you find the truth. For example, you've seen it on my website probably. March the 24th, 1945. Chief of Police in Dresden, reporting to Berlin, 5 weeks after the terrible British air raid on Dresden. He reports to Berlin saying, "Today the Lord Mayor of Dresden has informed me that he has opened these missing persons bureaus all over the city, and that as of this morning, 80 to 100,000 people are still registered by name as missing from the air raid." So all the people who tell me that only 5,000 or only 10,000 or only 20,000 people were killed in the air raid on Dresden, they didn't know about the existence of this intercepted message where the Lord Mayor tells the Chief of Police 80 to 100,000 people are still registered by us as missing, and the previous telegram 1 week earlier has made plain that when somebody is registered as missing, that means they are just a little heap of ashes, totally incinerated and unidentifiable somewhere in the ruins of the city. The decoded messages are absolutely platinum value.
David Irving exposed the full horror of that, and he exposed the wickedness of so-called strategic bombing, which just extended the horror of the war to killing civilians, a deliberate policy of killing civilians. I might say that the Air Ministry, towards the end of the war, their Deputy Secretary, Spite by name, said that our bombing of civilians was a glorious thing to do. Well, I don't think many people, when they think and consider the full horror and the inevitable retaliation here in Britain, would agree with that opinion, not when they consider the full opinion. And Irving did truth, and let it be said, the honour of Britain, a great service when he brought this book out as long ago as 1963.
They, the British air chiefs, argued that the desired result of reducing the German industrial production would be more readily achieved if the homes of the workers in the factories were destroyed, if the workers were kept busy arranging for the burial of their wives and children. Output might reasonably be expected to fall.
It was concentrated on working class houses because, as Professor Lindemann maintained, a higher percentage of bloodshed per ton of explosive drops could be expected from bombing houses built close together rather than by bombing higher class houses surrounded by gardens.
Well, you can justify anything if you want with words, but the strategic bombing, the deliberate targeting of civilians, women, children, old folk, was to make the war, the ghastliness, the horror of the war, 100 times worse. Of course, those who advocate the bombing of cities are always going to justify it in terms of, oh, there was factories here and there was railway marshalling yards there. But when you launch,
that was what I was thinking of. Yes.
But when you launch 1,000 bombers against a city, you're going to kill. I think the total death toll in Europe, the German death toll, the French death toll, because the RAF and the Americans were bombing French cities. Who knows that? Who knows that the RAF and the Americans were bombing French cities, our allies? If you add that to the Italian civilians and the British civilians and the civilians in Holland, who can justify that? Who can justify that?
There go the incendiaries.
Burnt alive.
Now, Michèle, when she goes to that court in Germany, will be performing the role of a modern Daniel in The Lion's Den. Michèle will be speaking truth to power in that courthouse. That's a formidable thing to do, to speak truth to power. And in that testing environment, facing the enemy on its home territory, I'm sure that Michèle will be guided and inspired by the example of the Canadian woman Monica Schaefer, the German lawyer Sylvia Stoltz, and the 92-year-old Ursula Haberbeck. So, gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, I'll give you a toast. Michèle.
Michèle!
Well done, Michèle. Well done. Well done. Good Lord. Good Lord. Good Lord. Well done. Well done.
I've never done this before.
I can only say in answer that every word that Richard has uttered applies to everyone at this table.
Rubbish.
So I am absolutely in fantastic company, and it's your company that's brought me to where I am.
Our company altogether.
Yes.
Our company
So
altogether.
I would suggest that this party is a celebration of the very three things that you mentioned.
Courage, energy, and knowledge of the facts.
Well, I'd say there are the four inseparable virtues, and I think, we share those. And so it's a wonderful celebration of the fact that all of us have those aspirations. And so I think it's wonderful.
Later on, while interviewing the Swiss revisionist Jürgen Graf at her London home, Michèle Lady Renouf receives a telephone call from her German attorney.
That there is a misnomer, just a minute. Well, I'm sorry for the interruption, Jürgen, but would you believe that was my German attorney, Wolfram Nahrath, calling me to tell me that there is now finally a date fixed by the court in Dresden for my trial on Friday the 15th of May. And apparently the judge expects there will be a lot of international interest in the case because of the absurd celebrity that the press themselves have created for me. So we'll...
So would you care to explain in a nutshell what you're being prosecuted for?
Well, it was an impromptu speech that I made when I went to the Dresden commemoration in 2018. It was simply because a German lady was standing in the near of where Richard Edmonds, who was going to speak because he speaks in German, and I, before the rally began, and she heard us speaking and she said, "You English, you have no right to be here." And people said to me, "Oh, take no notice." And I said, "I do take notice because I can understand why she says that. I'm in total sympathy with why the woman would say that, because after all, it was our terrible criminal allies who caused the most dreadful terror bombing upon civilians in that. So when the organizer of the event announced who was in the near of who was there were about 300 people, and a lot of the people know me, you see, and so they sort of had a bit of a cheer because he said I was there. So he then said, "Well, I think you're going to have to speak." And I said, "Well, I'd quite like to say why I think I need to be there for this German woman to understand the necessity for some English people to come and say an apology is due." I had made a film about the Dresden Holocaust, an apology to Germany is due, and so I read out what our the terror bombing command had said, that the idea was to make human torches out of civilians. And so I said then, of course, I had said that when there's a war, there are any number of people who don't want to go to war. But when your nation says we are at war, it's not Britain minus Tom, Ted and Fred. It doesn't work like that. You become the enemy whether you like it or not. And it is the same with the World Federation of Jews. When their leaders in America said, we are the fifth columnists, we are a state within a state, we declare an economic war on Germany to destroy Germany, they indict all of the Jews, whether those Jews are part of what he believes or not, Chaim Weizmann and so on, they become the enemy within Germany. And that is how war is. And so in the normal frame of things, those people are put into concentration camps. We did the same in England, they do the same in America, that's what happens. And I said there was nothing especially cruel of the Germans for doing that, of putting the people into a concentration camp. And my interpreter said, "I can't translate that. That is para 130, it's an illegal statement." And that is one of the statements that is considered
It's a fact.
Are you going to attend this trial?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yes, very much so. Because if I can just get out to the general public the idea that these tragic people, as you say yourself, you see in the films that these people who are innocent by and large. Of course they're innocent, but they're there because of their Jewish leaders who indicted them as fifth columnists. And this is not understood by the public. It's not the Germans who were responsible for having to put those people in concentration. It was their leaders in America. And I think if I can only get that one concept across, it will be worth whatever transpires in consequence of the trial.
Mein Name ist Wolfram Nahrath, ich bin Rechtsanwalt in Berlin, im Schwerpunkt Strafverteidiger und im Unterschwerpunkt im sogenannten politischen Strafrecht tätig. Im Zuge meiner Tätigkeit erhielt ich einen Anruf von Michèle Lady Renouf. Sie berichtete mir, dass gegen sie ein Ermittlungsverfahren eröffnet worden sei wegen Volksverhetzung aufgrund einer Wortergreifung einer kurzen Rede in Dresden im Februar 2018. Sie hatte Dresden besucht anlässlich der Wiederkehr der Bombardierung Dresdens durch angloamerikanische Bomber und war quasi von einer deutschen Frau in der Weise angesprochen worden, weshalb sie als britische Staatsbürgerin sich erlaube, in Dresden zu erscheinen. Daraufhin ergriff Michèle Lady Renouf das Wort am Mikrofon und hielt ihre kurze Rede. Polizei und auch Staatsanwaltschaften waren der Meinung, dass der Inhalt dieser Worte dem deutschen Strafrechtsparagraphen 130 Strafgesetzbuch unterläge und haben Ermittlungen aufgenommen. Nach Akteneinsicht konnte ich feststellen, dass die Worte von Lady Renouf aus meiner Sicht nicht korrekt übersetzt worden sind. Nach Akteneinsicht habe ich also eine Schutzschrift verfasst und beantragt, das Verfahren einzustellen. Diesem Antrag, dieser Anregung ist die Staatsanwaltschaft aber nicht nachgekommen. Sie hat beim Amtsgericht in Dresden einen Strafbefehl gegen Michèle Renouf beantragt, welcher vom Amtsgericht auch so erlassen wurde. Gegen diesen Strafbefehl habe ich dann im Auftrage meiner Mandantin Einspruch eingelegt, was zur Folge hat, dass dann die Sache vor Gericht verhandelt werden muss in einer öffentlichen Hauptverhandlung. Dann zog sich das Verfahren liegend bei Gericht eine ganze Weile hin und es sollte dann am 16. Oktober diesen Jahres in Dresden vor dem Amtsgericht verhandelt werden. Im Vorfeld dieses Termins gab es Gespräche und schriftlichen Verkehr mit dem Gericht, welches dann die Staatsanwaltschaft fragte, ob das Verfahren gegen Michèle Renouf nicht eingestellt werden könne. Ich habe dann Rücksprache gehalten mit meiner Mandantin, was so üblich ist, und sie stimmte einer Verfahrenseinstellung zu, nachdem auch die Staatsanwaltschaft ihr Einverständnis erklärt hatte. Damit war klar, dass der Termin am 16. Oktober nicht stattfinden wird und das Verfahren wurde nunmehr gegen Michèle Renouf endgültig eingestellt. Über die Hintergründe und die tatsächlichen Beweggründe, weshalb es zu einer Einstellung kam, kann nur spekuliert werden. Allerdings gehe ich davon aus, dass man beim Amtsgericht Dresden angesichts des Zeitablaufes, Tatzeit, die sogenannte Tatzeit, schon weit über 2 Jahre her, und auch des
zunehmenden Medieninteresses aus aller Welt an diesem Verfahren abgewogen hat, in welcher Weise man dieses Verfahren durchführen soll oder nicht. Letztlich halte ich es für vernünftig und auch den richtigen und gangbaren Weg, dieses Verfahren dann auf der Gerichtsebene einzustellen. Das hätte man sich aus meiner Sicht alles sparen können, wenn man das Verfahren schon in dem Ermittlungsverfahren bei der Staatsanwaltschaft Dresden eingestellt hätte. Mit der Einstellung des Verfahrens ist Michèle Lady Renouf unschuldig. Das heißt, eine Schuld wurde nie festgestellt und wird auch nicht festgestellt werden, sodass Frau Renouf sich als unschuldig bezeichnen kann. Sie wird nicht verurteilt, sie ist nicht bestraft und infolgedessen kann es aus diesem Strafverfahren für sie auch keine weiteren Folgen geben. That's it.
At last, German and British citizens have a victory over tyranny to celebrate. Due to pandemic regulations in England, this gathering was restricted to 6 persons outdoors and filmed with cheer in April 2021, despite inclement weather.
Thank you very much for coming, everyone. It's lovely to see you all here, representing the entire pool of our campaign, or at least our interest. In particular, our interest in Michèle's fabulous victory in Dresden.
Yeah. Yes, for that, yes.
So a round of applause for Michèle. And I felt that although everyone contributed very kindly to the shield for Wolfram,
wenn alle untreu werden, so bleiben wir doch treu, dass immer noch auf Erden für euch ein Fähnlein sei. Gefährten unserer Jugend, ihr Bilder besserer Zeit, die uns zu Männertugend und Liebestod geweiht.
And one person contributed, dare I say it, £1,000
wow.
directly to him.
And our steadfast Canadian couple, John and Linda Mortal, whose generosity and comradeship I personally value.
We had some money over, so I thought, apart from anything else, that Michèle deserved a medal of some sort as well.
Yes,
because it was, after all, her worry about being possibly incarcerated for 5 or maybe even longer years in a German prison, just for honouring or recognising Britain's responsibility for the Holocaust in Dresden.
Yes. Yes.
Which is a real Holocaust.
Yes.
And that gets taken to mean the wrong thing, saying you're not allowed to say that in German. So the accusation was completely misplaced in the first place, and it would have led to, I gather, because the Queen was it the Queen or the royal family were visiting Germany at the time she was waiting for her trial.
Too complicated. Too complicated.
That would have damaged the reputation of the opposition, and particularly even the German people, imprisoning someone who was apologising for what we did to them in 1945.
Well, we are very, very, very grateful to have you sit here. And also it's the sort of thing that would have come out during my trial, which would have been a revelation to people.
Yes.
Because it would have hit the headlines.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So whether ultimately I would have won or lost in personal terms what would have been revealed over that period of time, from one court to another court to the higher court and to the higher court, and more historic truths coming out, it would have been a victory in any case.
Even if you would have been sentenced in the future.
Yes, forget about that. The point is that it would have
we
succeeded.
do not risk that. The disturbance of the public order by that trial that would have been looked upon from the whole of the world, from interest. Many media people recognize, a former model and so on, and the lady, and that is, they come to the light like night flies to, there is
the people start to think.
And maybe they said, better to quit it, better to lay it down. Maybe I cannot look in their heads, but I guess
so it means that we will not, we will go not to Dresden.
No.
Oh, okay.
Finished.
The case will be laid down.
We have won. Yes. We have made them so frightened that they will not convict.
More or less. I don't know exactly, but that's what I guess.
I wanted to see Dresden.
They were afraid about the public, and they were afraid about the contents of the trial.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, her biography, British citizenship, in front of a German law at Dresden, where she has been in Dresden, and were forced by a German lady by the words, "How dare you to be here?" and a member of the Victory Nation, and then she came in front of the court. Look at that mixture. Look at that scene.
A bit strange.
Good say bizarre.
and wife of a former prisoner of war.
Yes.
And the matrimonial home was the home of the Prime Minister, the wartime Prime Minister.
Who rebuilt the bank system of Germany.
Well, yes, and also
get the highest order even.
And von Ribbentrop rented that home. Our matrimonial home was rented by von Ribbentrop. I mean, there are so many historical, interesting connections for people to take an interest in the trial itself because of the ingredients, you see.
It would be vivid history. It would have been performed there for 3 times on 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 days on court.
In different courts. Higher courts.
And Lady Michèle would have been able to speak about her, speak about the case, speak about the development, how she came to those words and what do they really mean. Oh my goodness, I think that would have been not
very safe.
Not very good, not very well to let her speak in her mother language, not in German. So
incredible, they are perfect.
I'm a little cynical. It's a victory second class.
So I thought we ought to have some kind of acknowledgement of that. I designed very roughly a thing showing her as St. Michael spearing Satan, you see.
We wish.
So I found this medieval picture of St. Michael, and I just did a rough sketch of this and put something around the edge about the victory in Dresden. And Mark Cotterill, the editor of H&D, said, I can get that made. I have badges made in China every so often. And I said, well, it's rather rough. So I sent him anyway this rough sketch. And these people in China turned it into a miraculous piece of artwork. I mean, it's beautifully done. You know, my rough lettering is perfectly done. I couldn't do it on a curve. They seem to be able to. And
in our script, you mean, as well? In our script?
In our script as
yes,
well.
Yes.
I mean, yes. And then we had a few disputes amongst us as to what it should look like. Eventually we had a compromise, and Michèle actually said, well, we should recognise the four virtues. That's really what she was fronting. So we had those added to the thing. They were a bit small, that's my fault, because I didn't leave enough room for them. But they got it on anyway. These Chinese people managed to write in English on the flag the tiny words, temperance. You can hardly read it. Anyway, so we've now got a few of these. So here's your badge, and I'd love to pin it on you, but I don't want to pierce your raincoat. It happens to be one of the worst days of the year so far.
It is beautiful, isn't it?
Well, everybody else who contributed is entitled to one, because we have to have quite a few made.
Oh, right. Well, you know, for me to be given something like this from my peers, I am, very touched and very honored. And the honor is really for the attorney, the German attorney, Wolfram Nahrath, because he was able to see, it was a little bit more, to be frank, there was a little bit more in my impromptu speech that was what they call dancing on the wire.
But this is an insult to Germany and an insult to all the white race. Because this shaft that is built by Libeskind is an Israeli architect who has no right whatever to put a shaft into Germans' military history. This should be opposed, deeply opposed.
Und das hier ist eine Beleidigung an alle weißen Menschen, insbesondere natürlich an uns Deutsche. Das ist das Militärhistorische Museum in Dresden. Und da hat der israelische Architekt Daniel Libeskind diese Scherbe oder diese Axtklinge reingebaut als Erweiterungsbau. Und dagegen sollte man sich wehren, denn das ist eine Beleidigung, nichts weiter.
I did say things that were touch and go. Volksverhetzung was what I was charged with, and so on.
There were important people in England who opposed the terror bombing. There were British people who opposed it. We were not all evil.
Es gab auch in England natürlich Menschen, die gegen diese Terrorbombardements waren. Nicht alle Engländer waren böse.
I will name you 5 people.
5 werde ich jetzt vorlesen.
George Bell, the Bishop of Chichester. Lord Hankey, the founder of the modern civil service. Sir Charles Snow, later Lord Snow, government scientist and author. The Right Honourable Richard Stokes, Labour MP and peace campaigner. These were some of the many who opposed. But unfortunately,
also das waren jetzt nur einige von vielen, die sich dagegen ausgesprochen haben.
But unfortunately, when your government declares a war on another government, it is not it's not Germany minus half a dozen people who don't want a war, or half a dozen people who don't want it in other countries. And this goes for the World Jewish Federation also. We are a state acting within a state. We are an enemy.
Wir sind ein Staat, der in einem Staat agiert. Wir sind ein Feind.
Now that's not my opinion. That is the statement of the World Zionist, the World Jewish, not Zionist, World Jewish. There was no, the state had not been made there. So as I say, when your government or your federation, which is the world government, declares a war on another country, you personally may not want to be part of the war, but unfortunately that's how it is in wartime. So that every Jew therefore was made by the Jewish Federation a fifth columnist.
Also das ist so, wie ich vorhin schon gesagt habe, wenn ein Land einen Krieg erklärt, dann ist eben jeder der Teil dieses Landes. Und das gilt eben auch für die Juden, die sich als fünfte Kolonne begriffen haben.
Therefore, it is normal practice in wartime to put your fifth columnists into concentration camps. That is normal. That is not exceptional cruelty by the Germans.
I wouldn't translate that because they could touch the 130s.
Yes. All right. In the end, after 2.5 years, admittedly, despite the duress bringing on a bout of painful shingles, the brinkmanship of this trial did not frighten me off, but rather the prospect frightened our enemy, our traditional enemy. And so it's not that I'm being given this, as I understand from James, for any sort of bravery or any sort of thing. I mean, in our field, bravery is nothing to do with it. Going to jail is nothing to do with it. That just comes with the territory. But what was achieved by my attorney was a victory over our enemy. That is what we
need a few, yes.
That's and that is very extremely rare. It's extremely rare, if not unheard of, in Germany, to frighten the prosecution to back down from prosecuting me for 5 years in a prison for what they call public incitement, Holocaust denial, etc., etc. And so that he was able to show them that it would backfire.
The arguments on the one hand side, and then the biography of Michèle Lady Renouf with all these connections and all what she did with charity. That's what I told to the judge. I said, you are dealing with a charity lady over years, yeah, with a high mentioned, high feeling lady. This is not a primitive English hooligan, smashing German policemen while during a football play or something like that. You are dealing with a lady who has been connected with chief of states anywhere in the world, even, yeah. And maybe I said,
maybe it's better.
There are some reasons to lay down all this stuff.
Because of the silly celebrity that the international press have created of me, it's too good to miss. They don't want to broadcast what we do and what we say, but it's very saleable because there were so many ingredients there. That my late husband was a prisoner of war during the war in Bavaria. And later on he helped reconstruct the German banking system with Hermann Arps, the head of the Deutsche Bank, and was awarded by the post-war Germany the Verdienstkreuz, the first honor given, the highest honor given to a foreigner. And of course he was knighted by the Queen for the same reason, to open up all the economic chances since 1913. For trade and so on. So there were just many aspects to my history, as it were, that caused Nahrath to say, and I'm quoting him now, he said, vivid history would have been performed there in the court. And that vivid history being recorded in the press simply because of the celebrity, that's all, because it was saleable, would have backfired, and the public in Germany would have realized that they don't have their sovereignty.
And look at the world now. Is it peaceful? No, there were hundreds of wars.
Immediately after.
Very often, more often the US was involved in such wars. The Soviet Union too. What? Brought their peace to Europe? Did they really end the war until now with Germany? No, they don't.
Korea, Vietnam.
Yes, and even Germany, yeah. There is no peace contract at all. okay, the weapons were laid down, the fighting ended, but there was, until now, nowadays we have no peace contract. And therefore in Germany, World War II is on. It's not really ended, has not really ended now. And this is the problem of the Federal Republic of Germany. Even if there would be good Germans to guide the Federal Republic, they are not able to bring out any decision for Germany as a whole. Because the World War II hasn't been stopped, hasn't been finished yet.
And my trial would have brought this out. We would have proceeded to
yes,
bring it out.
Yes.
Some laws of today's Federal Republic, including paragraph 130, under which I was charged, are merely an extension of laws imposed by these military occupiers. Uniquely, Germany is not allowed normal politics, since parties or activities or even academic work challenging certain interests and taboos can be defined arbitrarily as a form of Nazism and thereby banned.
Not, as school children today are led to believe, simply to defeat National Socialism, still less to rescue members of a particular race from their purported destruction in the jaws of a scientifically miraculous, unique mass murder weapon. No, as Dr. Schaub emphasises, the Western Allies, and in particular the leaders of the British Empire, had come to believe that they were fighting against the very concept of Germany, the very idea of Germany, the very existence of a united and sovereign German Reich, not simply the particular Reich of Adolf Hitler. Such a concept of fighting against the very concept of a united Germany is in British political and diplomatic history especially associated with the name of the former head of the British Foreign Office, Sir Robert Van Sittert, who inspired, of course, the faction that governed Britain in that period under Winston Churchill. I would quote, as just one example, the diary of one of Churchill's ministers, Gladwin Jebb. On that day, in January 1941, which of course was 5 months before Barbarossa, 11 months before the USA came into the war, Gladwin Jebb told a highly influential private small group of Britons and Poles in London, meeting over dinner in London, quote, that so long as all Germans, just because they speak German, are put together in one state, they will, just by reason of their numbers and capacities, be a menace to everybody else. This would be equally true whether their state was Nazi, communist or democratic. That is important. Yeah, monarchist or republican. The real peril, says Gladwin Jebb, the real peril to the peace of Europe is the conception of Deutschland. Therefore, there should be no Germany after the war, but a number of German states. End quote. So, remember the date here, January 1941. So this is before Theodor Kaufmann's Germany Must Perish, published later in 1941. We can see, at this point, as early as January 1941, the Van Sittert disciple Gladwin Jebb making clear the war aim of destroying German sovereignty itself. Hugh Dalton, the Minister for Economic Warfare, also in charge of the sabotage and subversive propaganda organisation. Quote, we cannot bear again that all the German tribes should stick together in a solid mass. Yeah. We should create conditions in which it shall seem to the Austrians and other South Germans the Austrians and other South Germans. Note the acknowledgement in that phrase. End quote. This again, of course, is 5 months before Barbarossa, with the Soviet Union not even in the war, at least officially not even in the war, perhaps preparing for war, who knows, but not officially at war. So, but the intention to divide Germany is already clear in January 1941.
But we are not sovereign.
We are not.
Stop this World War II, make a real peace contract with Germany as a whole, give us back the sovereignty, and then we can talk about German forces in foreign countries to help. But at the moment, I all found it for illegal. And I'm very, very sad to know that more than 70 German soldiers were killed during this so-called peace mission. There have been families here. Losing their dads.
So possibly all of this could have been brought out also in the trial, because in my speech I had said that significance, the relevance today of Dresden Holocaust is that ever since the Allies got away with swindling their way in Nuremberg to say we will judge against Germany, having themselves committed war crimes in deliberately targeting civilians. That is the whole point.
Even some weeks before.
Yes, so
a
year before. Yes, it's the proximity, the memory was there. And the people were the policy that I was trying to explain to that lady who said, you British have no right to be here at the commemoration. I understood why she said
you have no right no duty to be here in front of the court even.
Yes.
Yes, you can take your words, but not in front of a trial, in front of a court.
Yes, because I understood how she felt. But the point is that I could tell her what is in the documents, what is in the archive, what it's been published by Sykes. I've got the book that I was going to bring to the court by Sykes and so on. And so the significance of Dresden Holocaust, where you're burning alive, that's a Holocaust, not cremation is not the same as Holocaust.
Of course.
They were cremated, they were Holocausted alive. And the significance is that all wars ever since have targeted civilians. It's been a policy. Moral bombing, they call it. Moral bombing. And this is disgraceful. And it all began in Dresden. That was what I was trying to point out.
And Berlin and all the other
60 German towns and cities. 60. It was the plan. It was a pre-plan.
In a nutshell, Sir Charles Snow disclosed that early in 1942, the exact date it now appears was March the 30th, Professor Lindemann submitted a minute to the War Cabinet in which he urged that bombing henceforth should be directed against German working-class houses in preference to military objectives which were much more difficult to hit. He claimed that, given a total concentration of effort on the production of aircraft suitable for this work, 50% of all the houses in the cities and towns in Germany with over 50,000 inhabitants would be destroyed. Sir Charles declared that the Lindemann plan to initiate terror bombing against Germany was adopted by the British government and put into action with every effort the country could make. This decision of the War Cabinet was kept a closely guarded secret from the British public for nearly 20 years, until it was unobtrusively revealed in 1961 in a little book entitled Science and Government. Quote, factories and military objectives had long since been forgotten, except in official bulletins. The paper claimed that, given a total concentration of effort on the production and use of aircraft, it would be possible in all the larger German towns, that is, those with more than 50,000 inhabitants, to destroy 50% of all houses. End of quotation from C.P. Snow's book.
Those Lancaster bombers were designed specifically to come behind enemy lines, which was intending to kill civilians. And that is the significance for us today of Dresden.
Yes.
Not just that it was a dreadful thing, but today
that is the policy. Coming back to the Dresden situation, that when Her Majesty the Queen opened this tribute to the terror bombers of Britain, I would like to read to you what some sensible people say in England about that.
Und ich möchte jetzt einmal vorlesen, was einige vernünftige Menschen gesagt haben, als die Queen dieses Mahnmal für die Terrorbomber eröffnet hat.
This is a quote from Professor Richard Overy, who is one of Britain's most distinguished military historians.
Das ist ein Zitat von Richard Overy, einer der bedeutendsten Militärhistorikern.
Yes. And he wrote in The Guardian, it's a left-wing newspaper, but sometimes people start, as I hear, in the left because they think that the left is helpful to all people, but when they realize what the left really means, then they come to us, nationalists.
Und das Zitat, das stand im Guardian, das ist eine linke Tageszeitung, aber wie ich ja gehört habe, gibt es das öfter, dass man von der linken Seite auf die rechte Seite überwechselt.
So, I quote him, the RAF, that's the Royal Air Force, Bomber Command deserves to be remembered with honesty.
Und die britische Luftwaffe,
The British Bomber Command deserves to be remembered with honesty.
Oh, das Honesty ist ernst, ne?
With honesty.
Also der Bomber soll ehrenvoll gedacht werden. Mit Ehrlichkeit. Ja, klar. Ja, ehrlich.
Professor Overy maintains, quote, it is surely time that the ethical subterfuge performed all through the war in pretending that city areas were military targets, justified targets, needs to be confronted honestly. Yet it was possible for the RAF Chief of Staff Charles Portal to suggest that the RAF hoped to kill 900,000 German civilians without raising any demur among wartime leaders except over its feasibility, its possibility. Somehow bombing created a moral blind spot that allowed airmen to do to the enemy population what soldiers could not. End quote.
On 13th February 1945, I was a navigator on one of the Lancaster bombers which devastated Dresden. I well remember the briefing by our group captain. We were told that the Red Army was thrusting towards Dresden, and that the town would be crowded with refugees, and that the centre of the town would be full of women and children. Our aiming point would be the marketplace. I recall that we were somewhat uneasy, but we did as we were told. We accordingly bombed the target, and on our way back our wireless operator picked up a German broadcast accusing the RAF of terror tactics, and those 65,000 civilians had died. We dismissed this as German propaganda. The penny didn't drop until a few weeks later, when my squadron received a visit from the Crown Film Unit, who were making the wartime propaganda films. There was a mock briefing, with one notable difference. The same group captain now said, as the marketplace would be filled with women and children, on no account would we bomb the centre of the town. Instead, our aiming point would be a vital railway junction to the east. I can categorically confirm that the Dresden raid was a black mark on Britain's war record. The air crews on my squadron were convinced that this wicked act was not instigated by our much respected governor, Butch Harris, but by Churchill. I've waited 29 years to say this, and it still worries me.
So I just say to you, when the historians want to say that only 25,000 were made into human torches in this city by our wicked British policymakers, They actually aimed for 900,000. That's nearly 1 million. That's what they wanted. They didn't get as many, but they got probably 500,000. But in any case, they aimed for that. And ever since, they have used the success of getting away with what happened here to get away with all of the wars ever since. And that's why we have all of these refugees.
The Allies are still running the show. The Allies, as Richard Edmonds said, allies equals all liars. And so, the 4 virtues, it was Robert Forrison who once said to me that I had virtus. And I said, Robert, what in the world do you mean I've got virtus? Virtus means manliness in the Hellenic term. He said,
I'm going to say something about Michèle Renouf. Of course, everyone would say she's charming, she's beautiful, and so on. Although I am a Frenchman, I'm not going to say that. No. I am going to say that this strange lady has something that the Romans called virtus, V-I-R-T-U-S. It means, of course, virtue, but at the beginning it means vir. Vir means man, not woman, man. And virtues is what makes a man to be a man. And she has this, for me, she has this virtus of the Romans.
it is the qualities of the 4 inseparable classical virtues, which is temperance, which is balance, sense of measure. Then you have justice, but unbiased, of course. Then you have wisdom, but in the classical Greek tradition, that meant with scientific attitude, a la revisionism. And then, of course, courage, but they don't mean, the Greeks meant courage as in empathetic courage, that you save a child from drowning, or that, it's that sort of thing, rather than vainglory. You're not seeking, you don't do something courageous because you want to be famous, and those 4 must be inseparable. And I must say that in this field that I suddenly found myself in because of David Irving's trial in 2000, I didn't know anything before that, I have come across people with virtus infinitely greater than anything that Robert wanted to attribute to me. And, it's the positive nature that I like to emphasize, not our enemy. I don't want to emphasize the successes of our enemy. I want to emphasize the successes that we have.
Firm courage in difficult suffering, help where innocence weeps, oaths sworn to eternity, truth against friend and foe, manly courage before the King's throne. Brothers, it would be worth all the chattels and blood, all praise to merit. Down with the pack of liars.
The legal team, mobilised by Lady Renouf in London in 2008, enabled Dr Frederick Tobin to win a historic victory in Britain over German prosecutors. These prosecutors had sought to extradite Dr Tobin to Germany after he was taken from his plane while in transit at London's Heathrow Airport. European arrest warrants at that time meant that the usual procedure was to rubber stamp requests from EU courts. In Dr Tobin's case, this would have had the effect of backdoor criminalisation of so-called Holocaust denial in the UK, harmonising the UK with the 26 other EU states and their debate-denying laws. Yet despite this victory and despite Brexit, UK citizens and visitors remain at risk of extradition to a German jail. Brexit has led to the European arrest warrant being replaced by new and largely untested fast-track extradition procedures to EU countries, including Germany. However, a crucial aspect remains whether the alleged crime of Holocaust denial took place straightforwardly on German soil, as in the case of Lady Renouf's speech, in which case extradition is likely, or whether, as in the case of Dr Tobin, the alleged denial was part of a cross-border international publication, in which case a Tobin-style defence might well succeed in blocking extradition.
And it's through Wolfram Nahrath that we have this all of us in Britain share in that victory that he made for a British person. And it's very wrong to imagine that some people have said that, oh, the British can go to Germany, they say what they want, and they'll just skip off home. Well, no, you won't. You'll wind up 5 years in a prison if you weren't careful of how you presented it. You can't just blurt out what you want to say, because the public have been the propaganda is such that the people don't understand what we understand because of revisionism. So you can't just sort of say things without first creating some sort of a means to say them. So I was very careful in Dresden. I didn't blurt out things. I, was careful. But without Nahrath, I wouldn't be sitting here now.
Before the trial starts, I gave them the chance to lay it down. They didn't. They want the trial. And now I think they got under pressure, said, okay, better to lay it down silently, but to risk maybe an acquittal with a loud publicity, not only in Germany, but in Great Britain and the whole world, because the judge and prosecutor know how many people were very, very interested in that trial. And if she would have got sentenced in the lowest step of the court, they all know it will go one higher to the county court. And if the county court would said, okay, she will be sentenced, we will go to the Supreme Court of the land, the federal land of Saxonia, and even to the Constitutional Court. So this publicity,
More and more.
Again and again and again. Yeah.
Maybe it's better.
Better to let this case die silently, if you understand what I mean. Yeah. So there was, there was for 2, 3, 4 days this gate was open, and I asked Michèle, Lady Renouf, should we go that path? And we talked a lot about. She said I have to think it over for one night, and finally we took that way, because for her and for all of them of risk anytime. So it is, but it was a good way.
And so I was really very touched. I'm very touched to have this, James. I really, really am. And it's not just me, it's for all of us. The British have had this achievement.
And we haven't got the courage to do what you did.
Oh, no, yes, of course you have. Yeah, absolutely. And really, I feel very strongly an empathy that Richard Edmonds felt with Wolfram Nahrath.
I'm sure that we're all absolutely impressed with the work, Michèle, that you have done in this establishment. So I know. Due to the fact that the earlier hero had got to the end of his life and was running down, this building itself parallel run down, and Michèle has done enormous work. However, I will say it's a great honour to be here with our Dutch friends, and in particular our heroes who preceded me, Joe Palese, Dr. Henny, and Grace, who came here from Japan to remind us to remember the fallen of the two world wars, because I think that is our motivation. That I think probably everybody in this room has loved ones, fathers, mothers, grandfathers, grandmothers, and we are all motivated by the thought of our own families, and we're motivated in a political sense by the system that brought about the two world wars and the grief that we're suffering now.
When Richard was dying, and he was very valiant, Richard, always. He is an extremely valuable, we call him a national treasure in England. He is a veteran of nationalism. He didn't tell most people. I was very fortunate to be one of the very few that he mentioned it to me. And he was translating the Yuletide poem written by Wolfram Nahrath. I said to Wolfram, Richard has just translated this. He wasn't well, and did that. And Wolfram sent me a little text saying, "An honour for me." And so I said to Richard, the Germans feel very strongly, and that's how they say it. And Richard was very, very pleased about that. He was glad to be honoured by the equally honoured by the Germans as the Germans were honouring him. And so I think that when Richard died, really the following day, he died thinking of positive things, of our people, not thinking about the enemy and what they want to do and so on, but thinking about what we are. And Richard was an exponent of these four inseparable virtues. He really, really was. So I am aware, as you are, that we are in countries that do not have freedom of historical research. So we are in countries, including mine, where there is no freedom on a particular period of history for normal historical research without exception.
Ja, wir sind in einem Land, in dem es für einen bestimmten Bereich der Geschichte eben keine freie Forschung gibt, in der es, ja, wie man merkt, strafbewehrt ist, gewisse Dinge zu sagen.
So I am proud to be your comrade. I am proud to be coming from England, to be and stand with you today, contrary to what the German woman felt. I am proud to be here and should be here, because we are comrades in a common cause.
Und ich bin stolz, ein Kamerad von euch zu sein, denn wir sind Kameraden in einem gemeinsamen Kampf, in einer gemeinsamen Sache.
Do you see over the road here, across the cafe, on a wall, it says, "Good night, white pride." Do you see it? In big letters.
An dem Bretterzaun da vorne, gegenüber der Straßenbahnhaltestelle, da steht in großen Buchstaben "Good night, white pride." Gute Nacht, weißer Stolz.
So it is not just Germany that our powers that should not be wish to destroy. It is all white people and their countries.
Es geht also nicht nur um Deutsche, die von dieser gewissen Macht zerstört werden sollen, sondern es geht gegen alle weißen Länder.
Believe me, German people, you need the rest of the white world to stand with you. And I certainly am one such small person.
Glaubt mir, Deutsche, ihr braucht den Rest der weißen Welt im Kampf mit euch. Und ich bin so eine Person.
Because this artificial mass migration of the third world, and some of them are innocent, some of them are, because we have had wars on these countries in Arabia, because one country wants the Nile to the Euphrates. A little difficult. Some of these refugees are refugees, but it does not help them to come to white countries. We must help them to go back and fight for their heritage and their own people.
Einige der Flüchtlinge, die herkommen, sind tatsächlich Flüchtlinge. Aber es hilft ihnen nicht, wenn sie hierher kommen. Sie müssen zurück und dort für ihr eigenes Erbe kämpfen.
Believe me, I am deeply sympathetic with the real refugees of Arabia and so on, because our wicked policymakers are still aiming at civilians like they did in Dresden in 1945.
Und ich habe tiefstes Mitgefühl für alle wirklichen Flüchtlinge, denn unsere Politikmacher, die verhexten Politikmacher, die haben es immer noch auf Zivilisten abgesehen, so wie damals 1945.
It is because they got away with this Dresden Holocaust and 60 German civilians, 60 German cities and villages were attacked deliberately. We know this from the records in Britain. This was deliberate. And since they got away with it in the Nuremberg phony trials, now all of these war crimes are attacking and targeting civilians. It all started here.
So, und alles begann hier, nur weil sie davongekommen sind mit ihrem Krieg gegen Zivilisten, ja, und nicht verurteilt wurden in dem Kriegsverbrecherprozess in Nürnberg. Deswegen können sie weitermachen damit.
But whatever brings the foreigners to this country and to all of our white countries, and it is only to white countries, we must help them in some way or other to go back to their heritage, to be proud of their heritage and their race.
Und deswegen müssen wir allen helfen, allen armen Seelen, die aus anderen Ländern hierher kommen, dass sie zurückgehen können und dort eben in ihrer Umgebung und ihr Erbe pflegen können, ihre Herkunft pflegen können.
We can be proud of our white race because these refugees and these economic migrants want to come to our countries. So clearly, white people must be able to do something valuable. Otherwise, why are we not emigrating to their countries?
Und wir weißen Menschen können stolz auf uns sein, denn die Armen kommen ja alle zu uns. Aber kaum einer aus den weißen Gesellschaften macht sich auf den Weg zu ihnen. Also irgendwas muss ja an uns weißen Gesellschaften dran sein. Ne?
So, in answer to whoever wrote in English on the wall there, "Good night, white pride," I say hello again, white pride, and hello again to all the races. Let us all be proud. Let us be anti-global, and let us have our world as we have been told that the races are thoughts of God.
Und zu denjenigen, die das an den Bretterzaun geschrieben haben, gute Nacht, weißer Stolz, denen möchte ich sagen, hallo, weißer Stolz. Denn wir haben jeden Grund, stolz zu sein und auch müssen darauf achten, dass es Rassen gibt. Es gibt Verschiedenheit von Gott gegeben und das sollen wir auch achten.
Now I wouldn't like to quote who said that first, but you all know who I'm quoting, I think.
You know, I'm sitting next to people now. I'm sitting next to people such as Dr James Thring, Adrian Romilly, who to me do marvellous things because they put out into the public as much as possible our ideas wherever they get the chance. Adrian writes to the newspapers and he quite often gets things in to local newspapers, and he, you know, these are ways of getting to the truth to our people. And James does the same thing. He's always writing to any answers and sometimes occasionally getting on. And you know, I think we have people of virtus among us. And so today is really a celebration for me of my peers. And I'm really honoured to think that, you know, I was able to go to Germany and represent you, really.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You know, and that's how the Germans said it. The Germans said, you did it for us. And I said, well, actually, I thought I did it for the British.
Right-wing British National Party has won its first seat on a local council. The extreme right British National Party has won a local government seat, its first ever election victory. Last night, its candidate, David Irving, polled 1,480 votes, defeating Labour by just 7 votes in the Millwall ward of Tower Hamlets.
The right-wing party narrowly defeated Labour after a recount. The BNP called its first election win a victory for Britain. It had campaigned against the allocation of council homes in Tower Hamlets to Asian families. The council's Liberal Democrat leader called the by-election result shameful.
The extreme right-wing British National Party has won its first election victory, a seat on an East London council. In the Millwall ward of Tower Hamlets, the BNP polled 1,480 votes, defeating Labour by just 7 votes.
There were no more than 100 British National Party supporters outside the count on the Isle of Dogs, but they made a lot of noise. The other side of a divide marshalled by riot squads and police horses, left-wing campaigners tried to shout louder. They clashed only when one BNP gang hurled bottles and bricks over a wall, just before, after a recount, the result for the Millwall seat was declared.
Beacon Derek William 1480.
Just 7 votes ahead of a close Labour-Liberal Democrat split, the BNP had its first British council seat in a decade's existence.
The British people are no longer prepared to be treated as second-class citizens in their own country. The British people have had enough. We are going to take our country back.
Derek Beacon took the Tower Hamlets seat for the British National Party, the first time an extreme right-wing party had taken a council seat in Britain since the 1970s.
The British people are no longer prepared to be treated as second-class citizens in their own country. The British people have had enough. We are going to take our country back.
What Derek Beacon stands for.
How can blacks and Asians sleep secure in their homes knowing that you're advocating a policy of compulsory repatriation?
Well, they can sleep perfectly safely because, you know, all we're advocating is stopping immigration into the country and starting repatriation of the Asians that are already here. Only back to their own countries. You know, surely they'd be happier in their own countries than here.
But aren't these
we don't get on with them, they don't get on with us.
Aren't your policies, though, encouraging thugs to simply take it out on the black and Asian community? It's legitimising racism.
No, I don't think it is. We're standing as candidates. We want the people to vote. We oppose all sorts of violence and attacks against whites also, which you don't hear much about in the media.
Do you think your presence here, though, is encouraging the mindless minority of thugs to take violent action against blacks and Asians?
No. I mean, Asians rioted on Friday night, so they're attacking whites. And so we're saying the multiracial site doesn't work, and repatriation is the only humane answer to it.
I voted for the British National Party. I did vote for them, yes, because I believe in them. We've got to do something to stand up for ourselves, and they're the only people to help us. Fair enough?
I've got nothing against the immigrants, but you cannot keep bringing immigrants onto a small place like this with no schooling, no housing, and nothing to accommodate the people what have lived here all their life, growing up to and going there.
I mean, we've lived through the war. We know what the Nazi Party is, don't we?
But you voted for them?
No, they're not. I don't think they are the Nazi Party.
Clearly there's a lot more to be said, and we're going to get plenty more of reaction like that throughout the day. But however the main political parties blame one another, the BNP is going to turn around and say, we won, and that surely is the will of the people.
Recalling the ever-relevant observation made by British historian David Irving that, quote, if the British soldiers on the beaches of Normandy in 1944 could have looked forward to the end of the century and see what England had become, they would not have bothered to advance another 40 yards up the beach.
May this fair land we love so well, in a dignity and freedom dwell. Though worlds may change and go awry, while there is still one voice to cry.
Tag, liebe deutsche Freunde. Ich heiße Richard Edmonds. Ich bin Brite.
And also the grateful German nationalists. They want to honour Richard Edmonds in Germany, and sometime when we can, we will all gather there and celebrate.
To Richard.
Yes,
to Richard
Edmonds, a great patriot,
fellow.
a magnificent orator.
And you will always follow him in the crowd.
The wit, his wit.
Well, no, but when he was leading us to a meeting, you could always see him about 20 feet ahead, with a little flock of people following after him.
Yes,
nothing wrong with that.
Yes, no, and the other person that I wish we had spent more time celebrating was the late Tony Hancock and his father.
Yes, good man.
Because they were the publishers. They were talking about courage. They had their premises burned. I mean, it's all very well people sort of saying, "Oh, people say terrible things about me on the emails and or Twitter or something." I mean, it's a different thing to being a little bit insulted, on social media and actually having the Antifa at your door, which has happened in my case in the thing, and of course at Tony Hancock's printing press. He had fire, arson.
Yes. Didn't Richard have a shop?
Yes, that's right.
Wasn't that
that's
burnt
right.
out?
Yes, he had the same with his shop being constantly windows smashed and all that sort of thing. These are frontline people.
He and I chose the premises between us.
Really?
Did you really?
We did. We in fact explored the Welling district, which was sort of pitched on as the ideal location.
Why was
I don't know
way back in 1988, and we decided that yes, that's the place.
What's Welling got that Brixton hasn't?
Well, we could try white people.
And there's another man, if I may remember. I don't know if you know.
Richard actually lived there.
I don't know if you knew Tom Callow. Gordon Callow was his proper name.
Good man.
Well, I'd love to remember him too, because he was very helpful to me in educating me. He was a man who had little education, formal education, but he was a wide reader and obviously a man of great intellect with no actual
qualifications.
He was quiet, calm, rational and knowledgeable.
Very, very knowledgeable. And a sort of the earth person.
Yes, absolutely.
Who had great ability, always leafleting. I mean, I love the people. I want to celebrate all the people who have leafleted throughout these decades and are leafleting right now.
You remember with Gordon too, that I've known and knew him years ago, way back in the 80s to early 90s. And Derek, of course, knew Gordon very well, didn't you? There was never a time when he was physically in good health, but he had an absolutely indomitable spirit.
Yes. Well, he was the one who introduced me to Manfred Roeder, which eventually led me to buy what the German press called the Reichshof. Because, you see, Adolf Hitler handed the baton, as it were, to Grand Admiral Dönitz.
That's right.
At the end of the war. And then Grand Admiral Dönitz handed it to attorney Manfred Roeder.
Oh, right.
And Manfred Roeder owns that house, the house Richburg.
It's now yours, is it?
Yes, and he begged me to buy it for him, to be the caretaker there. He's another man who is to be celebrated.
Tatsächlich in den Schulen, in den Kindergärten, auf der Straße in bestimmten Vierteln nicht mehr in Deutschland führt, sondern in einem völlig verfremdeten Land. Wir sind gewiss keine Ausländerfeinde. Wir Deutschen haben bewiesen, dass wir immer wieder uns dafür eingesetzt haben, für Völkerverständigung, für Gerechtigkeit in aller Welt. Aber dazu muss unser Land deutsch bleiben.
Because he was the right man for the job, because he had the sort of principle, he was a wonderful host, and he was a person who educated the young.
Weil ich seit 30 Jahren Öffentlichkeitsarbeit mache, weil ich mich vor allem in letzter Zeit auf die Jugendarbeit konzentriert habe und weil wir jeden Monat hier auf dem Knüll Schulungswochenenden durchführen, die weltweit bekannt geworden sind. Der Knüll ist tatsächlich ein international bekanntes Zentrum, wo Deutschtum gepflegt, erhalten, interpretiert wird, wo der Jugend grundlegende Maßstäbe beigebracht werden, was zur Erneuerung unseres Landes notwendig ist.
And so, you know, we have some very fine people, and really our day-to-day, and thank you very much, James, for getting us together, to invite about 50 people, and we have to say in this time, very, very difficult for people to get here, very difficult for us to even have this table of people, let alone the number that wanted to support. I mean, James was able to gather more than 50 people to represent this medal giving, and so really, you know, I'd love to.
Short notice too, wasn't it?
Yeah, and very short notice too. And I think that we must express our gratitude to James, because James is a great veteran, a really great veteran. Really great veteran, and you know, he's done so much for making the fight for the Palestinian right.
That's my main interest.
Yes, and you certainly, I mean, succinctly you make these arguments. James was the one who organised me to be able to screen my film about the Palestinian. The little bit of genuine revisionism I can claim to have done was in discovering Eric Lowe. And what he had to describe in his Palestine Scrapbook, 1945 to 48, what really happened in the founding of the criminal state of Israel. And what he was able to tell us and what he was able to archive, now that I recorded that on film, and that's in St Antony's College in Oxford.
I thought it would be interesting to get Philip Knightley to interview Mr. Lowe. Mr. Knightley had worked for 20 years on the Sunday Times. Having written a history on war correspondence from the late 19th century about how they'd had to deal with imposed mendacity and censure, yet 1945 to 1948, that period, was not in his book. It is a war and a period, for some reason, that we were not to hear about.
Eric Lowe.
I was relieved when my time to go in the forces came along. I was 18, it came almost on my birthday. I was called up, and we weren't surprised. We had thought that war had ended and conscription would end with it, but it didn't end. Within 3 or 4 months, I was called for overseas posting. I'd rather extended leave, various injections, and eventually on the 17th of February, we set sail for Palestine.
What was happening when you got there?
Well, it was a trouble of a degree I never thought possible. We come through Egypt. People were hostile in Egypt. The trains had shutters on, so they could stop throwing things into the windows. The climate got better as we went through Rafah. We had sights of the sea, the Mediterranean Sea. It seemed peaceful. The Arabs which greeted the trains, selling us fruit, their vegetables, their eggs, their bread, they all seemed very pleasant, totally different from the ones we'd seen in Egypt. And then when we got there, we were whipped to a camp, Camp 153, and we were told of the troubles. The first thing I was told was that the problem here, it is like as if the Romans were coming back to Britain and claiming Britain for themselves.
The Romans being the Jewish refugees coming to Palestine from all over Europe.
Yes, we'd seen the Jewish refugees on films, We'd heard them on the radio and everything. You were horror-struck with what was going on. You know, we felt sympathy for them.
Professor Robert Forrison.
Many European Jews died as a result of wartime actions, and notably in the typhus epidemic. But many Jews survived, and in their millions dispersed throughout the world, going as far as to create and people a new state, just 3 years later, that of Israel in 1948.
But then you realise that this Palestine was no bigger than Wales. Very small, it was a poor country, and they were expected to tolerate that, the numbers going like that.
Why were they going there? I mean, Britain promised a national home to the world's Jewry if they went to Palestine?
It was a letter from Lord Balfour to Baron Rothschild, promising them a homeland, not a state, a homeland. But he did add something that's got forgotten, not to the detriment of the indigenous population. You saw these people, pitiful they were, and you felt sorry for them, but then you realised these people were terrible. They were throwing bombs into open trucks, and it started in 1945 apparently, and worsened as the time went on. In December 45, just to show strength, the Irgun joined forces with the Haganah, and they did 100 bombs on various installations, police stations, railways, everywhere.
So these were terrorists you're talking about?
Oh, entirely terrorists. In fact, the first people they killed and that thing were Jews and Arabs.
So what was the aim of all this? I mean, what were these Jewish terrorist organisations trying to achieve?
The British government wanted to limit the number of refugees coming in, and they didn't want to. One incident that happened, the ship pulled into Haifa, and Britain was turning these ships back and sending them off to various destinations. And so that it wouldn't be turned back, the Jews planted a bomb in the engine room to disable the ship. Unfortunately, it more than disabled it, it was crowded with refugees. They sank it. They killed these refugees. They killed 1 or 2 Britons that were on. My friend Bill Taylor was on that ship. He was thrown into the sea, and for initially they couldn't believe that it had been done by their own people, by the Stern Gang.
The Stern Gang, of course, became a notorious terrorist organisation.
Yes, well, they were active in a way during the war. I mean, the Stern Gang was started by Abraham Stern. And in fact, he was advising people not to join the British Army, but to fight the arch enemy, which was Britain. And they were publishing leaflets and everything, and robbing banks. And in 1942, Menachem Begin came to Palestine from Poland, looking to fight freedom for what he called his country, and he took leadership.
Could you tell me something about the way that Jewish terrorists bombed the King David Hotel?
I knew about it because everybody was talking about it. It had been up to that point the worst atrocity. 91 people killed, many of them Arabs, probably more Arabs, simply because they were killed on a bus that was passing. Jews were killed in it, very few British soldiers. And what they did, they dressed as Arabs, and they took 7 milk churns into the basement of the hotel. They were packed with dynamite. And then they let off a petard outside, a small bomb, to, as they say, keep people away. But when that small bomb went off, it actually killed more people, simply because on the military wing, they went out to the windows to see what had gone off in the street. That wing then collapsed, and that killed more.
British terrorist organisation, Irgun Zwei Leumi, openly admitted responsibility for the bombing.
But this elegant and luxurious stone building, a landmark of colonial Jerusalem, was not only an hotel. Its southern wing served as the seat of the British government, and military headquarters in Palestine. Here was the office of the Chief Secretary of the Mandate government.
At 20 minutes to 1, on the 22nd of July 1946, there was a dull but very considerable explosion. It was a sort of terrific bump which shook the whole building, brought down a lot of the ceiling and pictures on the walls and things like that in my room, and covered the whole place with dust and with an impenetrable pall of smoke or fumes and dust, which brought practically total darkness.
When the smoke cleared, the southern wing of the King David Hotel was no more. Rescue squads removed from the rubble 91 corpses, Englishmen, Arabs and Jews. Amid the overall shock, the Irgun, commanded by Menachem Begin, announced its responsibility for the attack.
We did not imagine that even one life would be lost. We did our best to ensure that everyone would be evacuated from the King David Hotel. Everything was coordinated between the operations officer of the Haganah and our own. The timing, the warning, which was given in advance. The explosion occurred, just as we had planned it, about half an hour after the telephone warning was given. There were 3 warnings by telephone. The British did not heed our warnings.
No, definitely not. That is a very old story, which was put out by Mr. Begin and the Irgun after the event. I don't want to comment on the story except to say that it is absolutely untrue, that no warning was made to me or any member in the building or reached us in any way whatever. And even if I had have done, even supposing I received it, I could not, in the time available, have evacuated the site.
Well, the difference between the pre-war, I forget how many, about 118 Arabs were hanged by the British before the war. About 2 Jews or 3 Jews were hanged by the British after the war, and the terrorism was on a much grander scale than ever the Arabs did. And the Arabs were, after all, just trying to keep their country for themselves. That was injustice, and all this injustice began to come through gradually, because we went there with great sympathy, as the world was sympathetic to the Jews. You hadn't been there long before that sympathy wore away, and you saw a different side to this. Yeah.
Did the Jewish terrorists ever mount any attacks in Britain?
Yes, they tried to. They did if we call a letter bomb an attack. Yes, they did. A Major Roy Farron, a young Jew, died in his custody, and of course it was immediately said that he was murdered. Major Farron was interviewed, well, court-martialed and found not guilty, and he'd been a great man working behind the enemy lines in Europe during the war, so he was a good soldier. A letter bomb was sent to his home in Staffordshire. His brother opened the letter bomb and his brother was killed. Chaim Weizmann was the first president of Israel. He was a Jew, an Austrian Jew, naturalized British, and he was a man who'd been pressing for this. And his nephew came over, was turned away at the port because he was going to come there and announce their intention to carry their terrorism into Britain. But this was one that was thwarted and was turned away. I think there were other incidents. There was one bomb planted in the toilets in the House of Commons, but it didn't go off. A cleaner found it. So, yes, they intended bringing their terrorism to this country.
Again, you see, only an ordnance man, you know, pretty low ranking, but a great ability. A great ability to see and say that his senior officers had said that Jews coming to Palestine, let alone going back to Palestine, if they ever were there at all, after 2 millennia and claiming it for themselves, would be just as absurd as Romans today, after 2 millennia, coming back to Britain to claim it for themselves. And
even that wouldn't be too bad if they were to behave nicely. Well, probably the Italians might. Whereas the people in Palestine are not exactly behaving very nicely towards their host.
Well, they're behaving their anti-Gentile religion. Yes. So there's nothing surprising about that. And of course, James with Kitty Little, he took the Talmud to court once. You know, which is
not exactly the Talmud, but the, it was a booklet called The Longest Hatred, Anti-Gentilism. And he wrote this because a chap called Wistrich had written a book called
Robert Wistrich. Yes.
Robert Wistrich wrote a book called Anti-Semitism, The Longest Hatred. So he rushed out this lovely pamphlet countering all these lies in that book and saying that it was really the other way around. And they took Lady Birdwood, who was the publisher.
That's Lady. We were talking about that earlier in the year, weren't we? Yes.
We along with Alan Plain, who was from South Africa, incidentally, and published the Controversy of Zion after Reed died. He came along, he brought in his car all 12 volumes of the Talmud. And we carried these into court and piled them up next to Lady Birdwood. And she had Whittaker, a chap called Whittaker, as Mackenzie's friend to represent her. And he called on her to open one of the volumes of the Talmud to counter what the other side was saying, which was that what the quotes from it were not true and there were false translations. So she was about to reach for this thing in order to show, because you have the English on one side in the Solentino edition and the Hebrew.
It's in the Kensington Library, the reference library, yes.
Yeah. So she was about to do this, and the judge said, "I'm sorry, we can't accept that." She wasn't allowed to use this evidence in a court of law, because obviously the people on high must have said, "Oh, the Talmud, no, don't exist."
Yes, but that was still a very interesting possibility, and it could be potentially brought again if we got the right sort of people together to do that.
And maybe it's a matter of who you get to represent you, because I mean, with all due respect, Whittaker was only a layman in effect.
Yes.
He wasn't good at doing what I think Veronique would have been quite good at, which is finding a way through the legalese that they stopped.
Well, you know, you can't go to court and think that it's rather like in the Old Testament where Solomon decides that he's found the right woman who owns the baby. I mean, it only shows what a psychopath he is, that in fact he can't understand that you don't have to be the mother and own the baby in order not to have cruelty onto the baby. This is where empathy comes in. And so a lot of people, I think, have a wrong idea of when you go to court that you're going to get justice. It's not nothing to do with justice. It's to do with how you can argue a case. You can't just naively imagine. And we'd have had another victory, you know. We had a victory in 2008 over our enemy. Because if you remember that Dr. Frederick Tobin was arrested in transit at Heathrow Airport. He wasn't coming into Britain, he was in transit. And they arrested him, put him in Wandsworth, no, was it Wandsworth, I think? And they wanted to extradite him to Mannheim prison. And I knew Tobin because I'd gone to the Adelaide Festival in Australia, and by chance met him because they had the Wagner Festival. We were Wagnerians, you see. And then later on we got to know each other a bit better. And so when I heard about this, it was Dr. David Duke actually who rang me and said, "Do you know that Tobin is in prison?" And so I rang him. I was allowed to ring him in prison, and I'd heard that he had just said to the judge in his defence, "Oh, the world is my prison." You know, and so I said, "Well, dear Frederick, you know, I have interviewed Dr. Herbert Schaller, the attorney that got Irving out of prison in Austria in 2006. Would you allow me to mobilize a different defense, not the defense that you're using, but his defense, his way?" And so he allowed me. He didn't think we hadn't a chance, but he was willing, and we actually defeated our enemy. We had a victory. They backed away. So we've had 2 victories of them backing off. And so it's possible.
Yeah.
But you can't go it at a bull at a gate. You have to dance on the wire. And we had wonderful, the solicitor was Kevin Lowry Mullins, who's absolutely excellent. And Ben Watson, I think was his name, was the barrister. And Tobin would send me to them every morning when we went to the court. And they would say, "Well, we need your instruction." I said, "Well, I don't feel like an instructor. All I can say to you is that you must attack the vagueness of the law, because it is vague. And secondly, you must try to get the judge off the hook. You've got to give her a reason for saying, I wanted to extradite him, but the law and precedents and this, that and the other prevented me."
Yes.
So you keep her, because the fear, it's always the fear. They have to do what they must. And so he said, "You have a remarkable understanding." But it's really very simple.
Yes.
If merely the model, as I call myself, could figure it out, then it must be possible. And we won. And then when they brought the appeal, we said we're now going to take it to the House of Lords to have it openly discussed. The same way as James managed to get Lord Stoddart to show my film there of the British servicemen in 2004, and they were frightened. They don't want the exposure.
No.
The moment you have the means to expose them, they back off.
Yes.
And so
isn't there a Liberal woman who takes them on a little bit? I can't think. She's in the House of Lords, isn't she? I've forgotten her name now, but
there was a Lady Young, not Lady Young, for heaven's sake. Lady, she's retired now, Tong.
But she's in the House of Lords, isn't she?
Yeah, Baroness Tong.
Tong, that's
yes,
Tong,
she's
that's
retired now. Yeah, she was wonderful.
But she's in the Lords, isn't she still? Isn't she still in the Lords?
She's still there.
Well, in that case, she may be approachable. I'm suggesting she might be approachable.
Yes.
Over the Palestinians.
You have to be careful, as they all do, but she's the most likely person to take it up, I think, probably, especially if it had a Palestinian.
Well, that's right. The Palestinian angle would be appealing to her, wouldn't it?
I think it's the best way. I mean, what they're doing to the Palestinians is so blatantly criminal.
Well, they're at the front line for all of us.
Well,
they are at the front line for all of us. And you see Desmond wears that wonderful badge. He goes everywhere with that badge. Turn the camera to Desmond badge. And because he says that wherever he goes, everyone will come and say, I agree, yes, or thumbs up. Or
yeah, most unlikely people. I would say middle-class, conservative English people.
Next time. Bring a badge along.
Support it. It's just amazing.
Have you got any more of the badges?
Still, I've been wearing it for at least 5 or 6 years.
Yeah, can you
it
get
still
them?
amazes me some of the people that actually said. There must be millions of people who are aware out there. In fact, I know there are millions of people.
Well,
I get it all the time.
Well, actually, Desmond, that was one of the things that I said in my Dresden speech. But I simply want to say to you that don't despair. Don't despair because we are few. We are not few. Our enemy, our powers that should not be, and we know who they are, everybody, not just here, everybody in the world knows who they are because they know who they may not criticize. So be aware that everyone knows who I am referring to, including the police, including everybody. Little children know too. So they have the means to know all of us. We don't have the means very easily to know each other. But believe me, we are vast in the world, and we will triumph because source criticism will triumph, because we know truth will triumph.
Die Wahrheit wird siegen, das war's, genau, Dankeschön.
Red, white and blue, what does it mean to you? Surely you're proud, shout it out loud, Britons away! The Empire too, we can depend on you. Freedom remains, these are the chains, nothing can break. There'll always be an England, and England shall be free. If England means as much to you as